I know,
All
I
right,
just remembered it
morning.
now.
All right, back to before. Forget you heard anything from me, right? We have some pottery tools, right? We have things that we can scrape, things we can poke with, things we can stab with, things that we can carve with. Here's some carving tools, right? These loops are really good for, again, sort of whittling, right? We have the sword here. We can stab things with this. What's interesting is that, I don't know if you guys noticed this, your block of soap is probably transparent, right? But when you backlight these things, when you photograph them, oh, they are gorgeous. They're so nice, right? So if I put, I'll just try to adjust the camera here. Sorry, let me just put this up higher. Sorry, let me just take the phone out of the clip. Oh, this is so inept. Anyway, right? You can start to see that you can see through it more or less depending on how thin this gets and when you backlight it, right? And you can even add textures inside by, again, going from the side and beginning to stab this thing or sculpt this thing or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Let me just set this to landscape again. There we are. Okay, right, so I was going at it from the side, and then when you look at it from the front, you can see that pattern or texture almost as if there's like a hatch. I use that word again, hatch, right? But underneath the top surface or the bottom surface, right? So I can even go from a particular angle if I wanted to. I don't know how well you can see that. See those? Sorry. See those angles through? Anyway, these tools are pretty interesting. This one lets you like slice this thing like it's a loaf of bread. And related to that, let's talk about the size of your blocks. You should have each have bought a 5-pound block, and hopefully it was a whole block. And hopefully it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 inches by 3 inches by 4 inches. That corresponds to the exact shape, proportions of the shape that your sites were cropped at, right? So for instance, as you start to take your block, right, 8 by 3, and plan that's kind of the same size as your, as your site drawing was, okay? And that's on purpose, that's really intentional, okay? Now, one of the things you need to do, right, if you have say 8 inches by 3 inches already, the depth is going to be something like 4 inches. And what we want is 8 by 3 by 1.5. Refer to the project brief, measure twice, cut once. The project brief tells you you need 2 blocks. They need to be 8 inches by 3 inches and 1.5 inch thick, okay? So in order to get that 1.5 inches, I will just get out my handy dandy tape measure with a 25-foot standoff. This is a pretty impressive tape measure, I must add. And what I would do is I would, again, measure this, right? This is exactly the same block that you guys have. And it's been dyed purple, which is odd, but you don't have to worry about dyeing anything. But let's say I just want to cut this down to size now. So something that's 4 inches thick, I want to be able to slice into 2 1.5 inch sort of slices, right? What I would do is I would measure that, put the tick there. I'd measure down here as well and put the tick here. I would get out my scale or my straight edge, my metal ruler, and line it up with the ticks. I would use my poking device as the sort of drawing tool to score where I'm going to slice this thing. I don't know if you guys can see the score I just made. Okay. And then I'm very, very carefully following that score all the way down with this. This is where you have to be very careful because you don't want it to get away from you. If you push too hard, it flexes in unpredictable ways, okay? So again, you just want to make sure that you're being really, 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 really careful and patient and slowly slicing this thing in its long axis. Once I get to a certain point, I'm going to try to slowly, carefully pull it back. I'm going to start over here, and I'm going to try to make sure I'm following half of the cut from before. Try to move that back. But I'm going to, this time it's going to continue to slice further in along the length. All right. You get to a certain point, you don't have to go all the way through if you don't want to. You don't have to force anything. I'm just going to keep doing that. Just keep working it across the length of the soap, the block. Okay. Unfortunately, if this was like glass or plastic, we put that score and we could just bash it and beat it until it just like cracks right down the score. But soap isn't like that. It's much more, it's much less brittle, much more gooey, you might say. All right, just going to see if I can get this side going now. Don't give yourself a nasty paper cut either. So at the end, again, referring to the brief, you want to have two blocks that are pretty darn close, if not perfectly, 8 inches by 3 inches by 1.5 inches. Okay, that 8 by 3 is basically lines up with your plan that you did for your 2.1c. Just slowly working my way in here. You can see it's like, you know, just pushing it through each time. Maybe continuing it on this way. You want to be very careful. Look, if you have a nice factory edge, I mean, you're going to be sculpting this down anyway a bit, right? So it's not going to be necessarily perfect doing it this way. Although some folks have figured out how to do it perfectly. It's amazing. The folks who somehow are like the masters at models. Just going to slowly pull it apart a little bit here around that seam along the length here. Now I'm just going to go in the middle. It's like a wedge. Have you ever cut firewood with an axe? You know, you get it going, and then you just beat on it in the center with your axe until it splits all the way through. I'm doing this with the aluminum. Trying to. Here we go. Turn it the right way. That would probably help. Just keep putting pressure and working. You can open it up a little more. Okay. Your straight edge might be a way to push this through further. Again, don't give yourself a nasty paper cut. Wear gloves if you need to, yes. Essentially, you're slicing this. Annoyingly, it's in the long direction, but you're slicing this. Almost there. Just need to keep this going. Rock it back and forth. Again, you don't want to get it to the point of no return where you can't pull it out. Maybe, but you want to be careful. In fact, what you usually do with this soap base is you cut it into smaller squares and you melt it down in the microwave. And you can pour it in a form to cast it, you know, put your anagram or initials in it, sell it on Etsy or something. I don't know, whatever people do with it, but it's not my boat. Other people like doing that crap. We used to make architecture instead. Yay. All right, so. Just keep working it back and forth. The key thing is, again, I want to stress this. I know I keep repeating it, but I want to stress this. Patience, right? I'm not being very patient right now at the moment, honestly. So pull that through. Starting to open up more on both sides. Now I'm pretty confident once I get into that center, I can finish this off. Sharpen the metal blade. Well, if you want to, if you have a grinder, this is a sheet aluminum, so there's not much thickness there to begin with. You don't want to do is accidentally cut yourself with a self-made razor blade. But, whatever you want, Daniel. I don't care. Just don't blame me if don't cut off a finger. Don't get blood on your model or drawing either. Craft, right? Anyway. Use the miter box. Well, there you go. Except the saw isn't, I mean, you could try that. There you go. That miter box is going to be pretty handy though, anytime you use basswood. You guys just got the basswood dowels, but they make basswood scaled lumber. Oh, it's so incredible for models. Pull this out. Okay, just want to be really patient here and just pull this through. There we are. All right. It's actually smoother than I thought it was going to be. I wasn't being very patient. Now, other things you can do, right? I've seen people take these offcuts and attach them in patterns. I've seen folks take the sponge that comes with your kit and wet it, and then lightly polish the soap until it's smooth again to get rid of any scarring or anything. Okay. It's soap, so keep that in mind. You can always, take it to the shower with you, but just don't get any hairs in it. It'd be gross. All right, and then last but not least, again, it's all about carve, 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 right? You want to, this obviously isn't the right proportions. This is not 8 by 3 by 1.5, right? But I did want to sort of show that it's possible to cut these things in long ways. You do want to maintain the basic proportions if the block, so even if I'm, carving in some of these edges, overall the block bounding box is still going to be 8 by 3 by 1.5, okay? So let's say I'm getting really ambitious. Let me just do something here. In which case I'm really going back and forth and, whoa, destroying my phone in the process, which is not so cool, but whatever. And, in profile, I'm making a sort of S. Overall, I want some edges still touching that edge on, in this edge, 3 inches away from each other. This edge and this edge touching the edges 8 inches away from each other. Okay. I'm not sure where I'm going with this here. Really. Okay. However, we did give you plenty of examples of these models in your brief and in the presentation. So I don't even feel like I have to. So maybe we can show some past examples if you really want. What do you think, Jose? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think so.
And once you start carving this stuff, I don't know, it's kind of hard to stop. It's pretty fun, actually. It's therapeutic. You can just stab the crap out of something, right? When you feel like it, or whatever. Just got to be really careful. This is, again, it's not wood, but it has some qualities like other things, right? So, let's say I wanted to make this slightly bend or flexible, right? Just like wood, I could put a kerf cut in it, right? A series of grooves and scores that allow it to bend easier in one direction versus the other, right? Or I could add a texture from the side or the front, right? It's hard to see maybe with these. But again, there's various ways of, I could add a stipple. All you folks that were adding stipples before, look at this. You can add a stipple. Oh. And maybe with some better light, you would see that better, but. Okay. All right, so both the shape, the form, patterns, and textures work here, okay? And again, craft is the key, right? There's a number of ways you can begin to approach this. And I think you'll see that in some of the examples that we show, right? Some folks do what I just talked about, which is get a paper towel or a non-lint making cloth or the sponge or something, and they wet it down and they start to polish things and get it really nice and smooth, right? And some folks actually are very careful about how they use the tools and then leave the tool marks inside as part of the expression of how it's made and becomes a secondary texture with another set of information, right? So do I leave the tool marks in? Do I hide the tool marks? What's important? Is there a one versus the other shown throughout the model, right? Those sorts of considerations are game, right? Both in showing its process of fabrication as well as you know, how you begin to map the information from your drawings now three-dimensionally into these blocks of glycerin. Oftentimes you can see the one-to-one analog between the drawings and the marks that were made in the drawing and the types of marks or strokes or operations performed into the soap, okay? What's nice about having some offcuts, like this little piece that I cut off earlier, is that this is a perfect test piece to explore textures, to practice with, let's say, a particular carving tool, right? Or to try to get the perfect shape before I move on to the final block, right? And this works just like last week in that you're starting project 2.2 now on Monday. We're having you cut the 8x3x4 into two 8x3x1.5s so that the first draft can be done in an 8x3x1.5 from Wednesday. Friday, we have a work session. And then Monday, the final 2.2b is due, okay? So if you take your larger block and you cut it down into two 8x3x1.5s, and you know, one is pretty clearly like the good block and one is pretty clearly like, you know, it has some scarring in it from like, you know, maybe the side of the box must have been scraped while shipping or something, or it's not quite right. It doesn't, you know, you didn't quite have the factory corner there or whatever. Then use the less perfect one for your first draft on Wednesday, and use the better one for your final draft on the following Monday, okay? Does that make sense? So you have a set of tools here, and again, depending on how tight of a corner or how deep of a groove or how wide of a cutting you want to make, right? Or the sort of geometry you want to leave, right? Let's say you want to make some grooves, some trajectories from the site through this, right? Some streams of water, where water runs or flows or whatever you're doing, you know, watershed or whatever this is, right? There's different ways you could begin to make these carvings that help inform the shape and the texture of these things as we go, right? And so simply turning corners versus rounded loops, wider loops, tighter loops, right? You can begin to make a variety of different marks, shapes, textures, excavate more or less material at a time, right? Don't forget the stuff flexes. So be careful with it. You don't gonna get it too thin. But again, I'll show you some examples because we usually photograph these on light tables to make them glow from underneath, and you can see that effect, that translucent, transparent effect as you sculpt. Don't be afraid to hold it up to a window or even in just your computer screen to sort of backlight it as you're working in situ, in order to understand where you can make things thinner or where to make the next mark or something like that. Now my hands are all sticky. And so I'm going to pause and stop the recording now, and I'll be able to post this in case the night sections actually want to use it and find it helpful.